Let's review results from the On-Farm Network's 2023 soybean inoculant trials. The question is, with more soybean history in Manitoba, have we built up populations in the soil of the rhizobia species, Rhizobium japonicum, that colonizes soybean root nodules and is responsible for our nitrogen fixation? In terms of Rhizobia persistence in the soil, it survives Manitoba winters well. And the population does decline in a predictable fashion with time since soybeans were last growing. But the interesting piece of that is that the rate of decline is related to soybean history. At sites in Carmen and St. Adolphe, where the field has seen soybeans before, the decline of rhizobia over the years was pretty slow. Compare this to Melita that didn't have any soybean history, and the decline is much more rapid. In the On-Farm Network, we have two types of trials investigating soybean inoculation strategies. The first compares a double inoculation strategy to single inoculation, and the second compares a single inoculation strategy to no inoculant at all. The choice between these two trial types is dictated by the soybean history in a given field. As the number of soybean crops grown increases, can we reduce our input costs in terms of inoculant? First, we'll review the double versus single inoculation trials. The goal of these trials is to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of a seed-applied inoculant alone, or a single inoculation strategy versus a double inoculation strategy that combines a seed-applied inoculant with an inoculant in furrow. We're investigating that question of, can we reduce the amount of inoculant we put down as we build up the population of rhizobia in our soils? Ultimately, will we see a nodulation or yield response to that extra cost of an in-furrow inoculant? In 2023, there have been 6 trials comparing a single and double inoculation strategy across Manitoba. Before participating in these trials, fields must have seen at least 2 previous soybean crops, with the last crop occurring sometime in the last 4 years. Some background information. These trials have compared a liquid on-seed inoculant to a liquid on-seed plus furrow plus granular in furrow. Most of these trials have used nodulator and a handful testing Fix, Evergoal Energy, and Enro inoculant products. Average seeding rates were around 177,000 seeds per acre, with early season plant stand counts of 168 plants per acre. And 5 out of 6 trials were on narrow rows and 1 with wider rows. In these trials, we evaluate nodulation at flowering, most often at R1, and we're counting the number of pink nodules. The pink color indicates that they're actively fixing nitrogen. Plants are rated from 0 to 4 based on the number of nodules per plant. 10 active nodules per plant means adequate nitrogen fixation for maximum yield potential. What do we see for yield? Each set of paired bars represents an on-farm trial, with the lighter green bars on the left representing the yield of the single inoculant strips, and the darker green bars on the right representing the yield of the double inoculation strips. There have been no statistically significant yield responses where yield was improved with the double inoculation strategy. With regards to nodulation, ratings at flowering showed no significant differences between the double and single inoculation strategies. Economically, if we say granular inoculant is roughly $10 an acre and liquid is about $3 per acre, then we need to see a consistent yield increase to pay for the extra inoculant. Since we saw no improvement over the single inoculation, it would cost $10 per acre more. If moving to a single inoculation strategy is something you're curious in, we do have a checklist for moving to that strategy based on field history. 2 previous well-nodulated soybean crops and 1 within the last 4 years. Also note the no significant drought or flooding criteria. We have some research indicating these rhizobia will survive flooding, and we do have an on-farm research data set that has captured quite a few dry seasons, and we're still not seeing a response to a double inoculant strategy, so it's worth revisiting that bullet. Also, if this is something you're curious about, you can absolutely run an on-farm trial before committing to this on every acre. The other soybean inoculation strategy that we have investigated has been single inoculation versus none at all on fields with more soybean history. In the single versus none trials, we're aiming to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of a seed-applied inoculant versus no inoculant in soybean fields. With more soybean history, do we need an inoculant at all? Over the last year, 4 trials have compared a single inoculation strategy versus no inoculant, largely occurring in central and eastern Manitoba. To participate in these trials, fields require a minimum of at least 3 previous soybean crops and 2 soybeans within the last 4 years of the rotation. Some background information on these trials. These trials have compared a liquid on-seed inoculant to no inoculant. Most of the trials have used Celtec and a handful testing Signum soybean and nodulator inoculant products. Average seeding rates were around 221,000 seeds per acre, with early season plant stand counts of 158,000 plants per acre. All were seeded on 10-inch row spacing. We evaluate nodulation the same as we do in double inoculation trials by counting nodules at flowering. Reminder, 10 and above is a good nodule number to have because this means the bacteria are fixing enough nitrogen for maximum yield potential. When we look at the yield results from these trials, there has not been a statistical yield response to a single inoculant strategy. No inoculant has performed the same as a seed-applied inoculant. These fields have naturalized populations of Bradyrhizobium japonicum that are effectively colonizing root nodules and fixing nitrogen in the untreated strips. Does this mean you can eliminate inoculation on your fields with enough rhizobia built up? Let's talk more about that in a minute. In terms of economics, assuming a cost of $3 per acre for liquid on seed, we'll need to see a pretty small yield response of 1/4 of a bushel to pay for that inoculant. And we have not seen it pay for itself yet. But you could also look at this as a cheap insurance to avoid nodulation failure, which is a much more costly recovery. So do we have a strategy for these more experienced soybean fields? We can tell that these fields have built up japonicum populations. The question remains on these populations if they're surviving in the soil and reproducing with other native bacteria. Will they remain effective at fixing nitrogen? Will they continue to be effective at forming nodules with soybeans long term? Or will they put more resources into surviving in the soil? Answers to these questions will impact inoculation strategies long term. If the populations are surviving from 1 year to the next, maybe we can consider reducing our inoculant strategies from 2 to 1 and from 1 to none. This leads to questions if we should inoculate on a rotational basis or maybe only in challenging years. What I would recommend, though, is to assess nodulation in every soybean field every year. Soybeans need a minimum of 10 nodules per plant to achieve maximum yield. Assessing nodulation at flowering can help inform management decisions ahead of pod fill when soybeans start to draw on a lot of nitrogen. It gives you lead time to assess if a rescue may be necessary. The number of nodules you're finding can feed into future inoculant decisions on that field as well. And also, a reminder that fields best suited to soybeans have less than 50 pounds per acre of residual nitrogen to promote nodule growth and development. When nitrogen starts to get higher, soybeans start to get lazy and feed off of available nitrogen instead of spending the energy to create nodules. If you're interested in learning more about these results, every trial result is available in the On-Farm Network database available at manitobapulse.ca or by following this QR code. If you're interested in participating in a trial, contact myself. Thanks for listening about 2023 inoculation trial results and strategies. I've been Chris, MPSG's On-Farm Network agronomist. Follow us on social media to stay up to date.